365 Sports, Sam Kahn joined us quite a bit. We always appreciate it. In fact, like I mentioned, about an hour and a half from now, Bruce Feldman on his story about Air Raid defensive coordinator and what life is like there. Sam Kahn joins us on 365 Sports. Sam, all right, A&M seems to be the feature of this story about what's holding them back. What are the theories? Are they just jinxed? What's the deal?
I think some people would ask that, and I actually did ask some people that. I was like, do you guys just think you're cursed because it's been since 1939 and no conference championship since 98? But I think most people would say there's a combination of factors. I think the number one theory, in my opinion, is the administrative stability and alignment, the instability, I should say. Just when you look at programs that succeed at a high level consistently, programs like Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson, Oklahoma, there's a common thread amongst those programs in that there is stability at an administrative level. And that's important because you're going to have AD support, you're going to have presidential school campus support, and everybody pulling in the same direction. I don't think that there's any doubt that A&M has always wanted to win and done what it can to win, but just talking to Bowen Lofton, who was the president at A&M when they moved to the SEC, it certainly seemed like there were a lot of voices and a lot of power that wasn't necessarily generated at its presidential level at the school. And it made it a little bit tough to navigate through. But I also think there's other theories. I think head coaching hires are really important. The timing of those and whether you move on from somebody too soon or too late matters. Talent matters a whole lot, and they didn't always have that at the high level, but they're starting to now. And then sometimes it's just some bad luck and bad bounces that come into play too. So I think there's a combination of things. That's why we ended up, I think, with 5 or 6 of them, and I think all of them have some credence.
It might be all of them simultaneously, Sam, because I don't know if you did a care to achievement ratio on the Aggies. I don't know if there's anybody who cares as much but does not cross the finish line as they do in maybe any sport nationally.
Yeah, and the funny thing about this is they show up 100,000 strong every week in and week out. Like, you would be hard pressed to find a fan base more supportive than Texas A&M. But that was one of the things that Stephen McGee, the former quarterback who played there 2005, 2008, and still follows the program pretty closely, brought up to me was that the fans show up. He goes, but I wonder if they demand enough. Like, are the expectations high enough? He had said that he thinks maybe there is a culture that 9-3 is something that we're celebrating, as opposed to 9-3 not being good enough. Whereas at Alabama, if you go 9-3, they may be ready to fire people. And I think that's a fascinating dynamic and a fascinating thought because they haven't had great success for a long time. Like I said, we're talking about a drought in conference championship that's going back 24, 25 years now. We're talking about a national championship drought that's gone more than 80 years. So I certainly can understand if you are an Aggie, if a 9-3 season is celebrated because they haven't reached the elite. But if you're trying to break through from that upper or middle class to the elite class, then you do have to demand a little bit.
Sam, we had somebody who I don't think follows A&M all that closely that asked us, like, hey, is anything really all that different now for A&M than when they were in the Big 12? And obviously the easy answer is money and exposure because of just the SEC. And they had the Johnny Heisman run, of course, there early on as well, and it felt like the whole world was changing, right? It felt like they had finally arrived, and then since then, it's kind of, you touched on it, it's kind of been just sort of there. Is there anything else that's drastically changed in your mind from when they were a Big 12 school, outside of that Johnny run and the financial side of it? What else would you point to?
I think they have really recruited a higher level talent. When you look at the recruiting rankings, they've done a lot better on that front. They last year they were 4th in the 247 sports team talent composite, and I don't think there was ever a time in the Big 12 when you would say they had a talent that ranks in the top 10 in the country. They signed 6 top 10 classes since joining the conference. Before, when they were in the Big 12, they signed only 2 classes ranked in the top 10. So that to me, other than the money, other than the exposure and the relevance that comes with being in the SEC, that is the big difference. And you can see it on the field. When you go down on the field for warm-ups, I'll never forget, in 2015, when Kyle Allen and Kyler Murray were there, they played Alabama. I remember going down on the field at Kyle Field for warm-ups and pregame and looking at the difference in size between Alabama and A&M, and it was drastic. Like, you could tell that Alabama was just a different looking team than A&M. A&M had only been in the SEC for 3 years, so they really didn't even have 4 full years to recruit that at that time in the SEC. Now, when you go down and you go look at how A&M looks physically, especially on the line of scrimmage, defensive line, offensive line, compared to Alabama or LSU or teams of that nature, they look a lot closer to that now than they ever did in the Big 12 or they did in their first 2 years in the SEC.
What is the frustration level for one of, if not the most passionate and also loyal fan bases then in College Station?
I mean, it's extremely high, especially after what happened in 2022, because you had the number one recruiting class. You had a flirtation in 2020 with the playoffs. You just finished right outside that top 4, and then they finished 4th. And then you had that stub on your toe 2021 where they lost the quarterback and ended up 8-4. So you had all this foundation. You gave Jimbo the big contract, and all of a sudden you think, okay, 2022, 2023 has got to be the time that we're going to make that jump. And then what happened? You go 5-7. You have a 6-game losing streak. You lose to App State, and yeah, I would say frustration was an all-time high. And that's why this season upcoming in 2023 is so fascinating, because you've got a coach who's on a contract that's got more than $80 million left, and it's all guaranteed. And you have a fan base that is frustrated and wondering, is this still the guy to take us where we want to go? And it's a valid question at this point. We're going into year 6 of the Jimbo era. So I think it's pretty high frustration, because if you look at all the other ingredients, and this was part of the genesis of our pieces, facilities, fan support, you have recruiting footprint, you have everything that you would want a top 25 or elite program to have. And the only thing that you can't seem to do is break through and get to the top. And that's tremendously frustrating for them. And that's why I think this year is going to be so important, because how they do this year, I think, is going to tell us and chart the course for the next few.
Sam, you mentioned the head coaching hires. They have not, ever, like the last 3 are Coach Fran, or last 4, Coach Fran, who was at Francione was at Alabama. They went and got him after he had been at TCU and raised them to new heights. Kevin Sumlin was the hot coach coming out of Houston. Mike Sherman had the NFL pedigree, and then Jimbo Fisher, had a ring at Florida State. So they've always kind of gone for something that's kind of hot and interesting or bigger than what they've had. Do you think it would serve them well eventually, whenever Jimbo Fisher's not the coach, based on his level of success over the next few years, to maybe dig a little deeper than just what's the hottest name out there and who really would fit, even if it was like a D2 coach?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to look a little bit outside the box and go with somebody that isn't necessarily in conventional wisdom. That said, I won't lie. Head coaching hires, that's a very inexact science. And I can promise you, there have been guys that I thought were going to work out really well that never did. I thought Tom Herman was going to probably take Texas to the college football playoff, and he was gone after 4th season. So what was me for being able to say who they should and shouldn't hire? But I will say this. You look at some of the really good coaches right now. Lincoln Riley was a coordinator on staff who got promoted when Bob Stoops retired. Ryan Day, same deal, got promoted when Urban Meyer left Ohio State. Heck, if you even look in Texas A&M's history, after they fired Jackie Shore, after Jackie Shore resigned under pressure in the late 80s, they promoted R.C. Slocum as defensive coordinator. And he ended up being the winningest coach in school history and won multiple conference championships. So I don't think it always has to be the sexy hire. That said, I think it would be hard. The last 2 hires, Sumlin and Fisher, I think it's hard to quibble with them too much at the time, because Sumlin was the hot name and he did accomplish a lot at Houston, and he did get them off to a great start in the SEC. It's just that they weren't able to sustain it. And then Fisher was one of 4 active coaches at the time with a national championship ring. So I think it's hard to quibble with that. But you can nitpick and say, okay, Sumlin only did it at Houston, or you could say Fisher was starting to decline. You could see that in his last year, and you see signs of it at FSU. And I think some of that revisionist history, because I think if you would have went back then when it was happening, people were saying, "Oh, there's no way A&M can go hire Jimbo Fisher." So it's really hard to say, but I do think a lot of programs, not just A&M, would be well served to not just go hire the big name that's going to sell, that's going to win the press conference, that's going to get everybody excited. Sometimes it is the low key guy who maybe everybody doesn't know, that just knows how to win football games. And you mentioned a D2 coach. I mean, look at what Lance Leipold is doing so far at Kansas. Not to say that that's the kind of guy that A&M should go get, but just in general with coaching hires, sometimes it's okay to turn over a few more rocks.
Yeah, I would say right now, like if Jimbo Fisher's gone, December 1st this year, the fans are not going to say, let's go hire Lance Leipold. They're going to go, well, Sonny Dykes. That they're going to point. That's what they're going to do, and maybe that's not the best thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say Sonny Dykes, maybe Jeff Traylor, maybe at UTSA, Joey McGuire, possibly if Texas Tech has a 9 or 10 win season. I could see all those guys, but then I could also see them with the resources that A&M has. You also have the wherewithal to go try and get maybe a former NFL name or try to get somebody else, from another part of the country at another program that maybe is, available for whatever reason. But yeah, you're right. It may not be, it may not be a sexy hire. There may be somebody else down the road, but that's why it's important to have leadership that is clear and that you don't have just one person making the decision. You don't have one concentrated of 2 or 3 people that wield an unbalanced amount of power making those decisions. It's quite important, I think, to have a lot of different opinions and a lot of a centralized power structure that says, hey, here's the expectation where we're due, here's who we're going to talk to, and this is the way we're going to go.
Sam, culturally, and you touched on a little bit throughout the article on a lot of different things, but, for having not necessarily reached that mountaintop, they have had celebrations as though they have at time to time, like a number 1 recruiting class or when they beat Alabama and things like that. And so there was, I guess, some level of entitlement that was creeping in, that was evident last year with just the freshman class that kind of fizzled out in some ways. You had guys, racing their cars in the parking garage, and just it was a bad look overall. Do you feel like that's been taken care of and sort of rooted out and cured this offseason?
I don't know. Certainly, I think a lot of the guys from the freshman class who had become discipline issues, I mean, all those guys are gone. So that part, certainly, yes, that has been rectified. But does that mean that overall the culture is going to be better in the locker room? I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think one of the things, and me and Andy Staples did a story at the end of the 2022 season about what went wrong at A&M, and one of the biggest issues when we talked to people within the program was that discipline was an issue, and some of that fell at the feet of Jimbo Fisher, and in part because Fisher has the role of being the CEO coach, but also being so deep into the offense. And so it became a time management issue of not being able to balance all those things. So you go and hire Bobby Petrino. So does that mean now that Jimbo's going to have less involvement on offense? And does that mean he's going to have more time to handle those bigger picture issues? If you're an A&M fan, you probably better hope so, because that's what was missing last year. They didn't have a talent issue last year. They had a management issue, a discipline issue, and an injury issue. They did have a really unfortunate amount of injuries, but those first 2 things can be corrected if Jimbo makes the right steps as a coach. And so ultimately, I think we have to wait and see how that all plays out with the discipline. But the guys who were the ones getting suspended and who were the ones that were in the headlines, yeah, all those guys are no longer on the team.
Sam, but do you think that this is like fingernails on a chalkboard for Fisher to have to so-called give up the play calling duties? How is he going to react to this? Because he's been kind of defensive when he's been asked that question.
Oh, there's no question that I think it bothers him. I think you could see it when the first press conference of spring football, when you mentioned how he reacted to the Petrino questions. I've seen it just when he's been out on the speaking circuit. He hasn't had the same pep in his step that he's had in the offseason the last few years. And I base that only, let's take that with a grain of salt, because I'm basing that only on the few times that I've seen him in the offseason. It's not like we have a ton of access to this guy, and that's one of the unfortunate parts of that program. But the vibe seems different, and I don't think there's anybody who would argue with you and doubt that calling plays, running an offense, coaching quarterbacks, those are amongst the things that Jimbo loves to do the most. and now there's somebody else that's going to do that, ostensibly is going to do that. There's no doubt I think that's got to eat at him because this guy won a national championship 10 years ago doing those very things, running the offense at FSU, calling the plays, and coaching Jameis Winston. And so now people have told him, or people have criticized the offense and his management of it, saying that he's not good enough anymore. For a guy who's reached the pinnacle of his sport, heck yeah, I'm sure it bothers him, and I'm sure it eats at his ego. But he had to make the move because I think people could see the product on the field last year and how long they went without scoring even 28 points in a game. I think that streak went almost a whole calendar year against FBS competition. And when you have the talent that they have, that's just unacceptable.
Last thing, you wrote the story about the tragic death of Terry Price, who'd been ill, had been struggling with his health. Obviously a stunning story. Those, I guess, close to the program knew he had been struggling, but former player, obviously a beloved coach as well, and how much that affected that campus.
Yeah, it really did hit hard. And for those who know Terry Price, and I was one of the fortunate ones that got to know him over these last 10 years, he was just a great guy. He was an Aggie through and through. He played there. Of course, he spent his last 10 years coaching there. And he was just a great guy to be around. He always was. As a coach, he was a great coach. He was a great recruiter. You saw he was able to get Myles Garrett, who was the number one defensive end in the country at the time. But the reason he was able to be a good recruiter because he was a genuine guy. And there's a reason why he is the only full-time assistant coach that was held over or that was still held over 10 years later from that original Sumlin staff. And it's because he is highly respected in his craft, and he was highly respected as a man. And that's not to say nothing of his skills on the grill, which were fantastic. He was one of the best guys at being able to throw meat on a grill and serve you some good barbecue. Not being able to go to the D-line cookout is one of my biggest regrets because me and Terry Price have talked many times over the years about one day me going to the D-line cookout just to do a story about that because I thought it was so cool that they did it. I remember they had a really emotional one in 2013, I believe, when they lost one of their defensive linemen who had died in a car crash. But that has been such a big part of that team, especially to be able to build that camaraderie amongst those defensive players. At one point, it wasn't even just the D-line cookout. Later on, it became the whole defense, and later on, it became the whole team. He did it for recruiting events and pool parties, and he just left an indelible mark, and I know his loss is deeply felt at Texas A&M, and the people who knew him, it was just sad to see him go because he really contributed to that university in a lot of ways, but he was just such a damn good guy.
Thank you, Sam. We appreciate your time. Hope you have a great holiday weekend.
Thank you so much. Y'all too.
Sam Kahn Jr., theathletic.com, the story about A&M.